All right, guys, so we're going to talk about the somatic nervous system. This is our voluntary, sort of the thing that we're super aware of. We're going to describe the components of the somatic nervous system, describe the modalities and the submodalities of the sensory systems. We're going to distinguish between the central and the special, or the general and the special senses. We're going to describe the regions of the central nervous system that contribute to somatic functions, and then the stimulus and response motor pathway. So the somatic nervous system, this really big job is for reflex movements, so for protection of us, as well as voluntary movements of our muscles and our organs. So with reflexes, we start with the receptor within our skin. Okay. That receptor within our skin is going to be sensing usually some sort of pain because we often don't have a reflex response unless there is a sense of pain. Okay. And so that's then going to be attached into a sensory neuron. So that sensory neuron, we also sometimes call that the afferent with an A pathway because that's an arriving signal to our central nervous system. So again, the signal's traveling here from that receptor through the sensory neuron, and then we're going to have this integration system happening here within the interneuron. Now, at that point, we're going to then send the signal through our motor neurons. So this is going to be an efferent pathway, and it's going to hit an effector, which is usually as part of our skeletal muscle. So for instance, if you were to touch maybe like a sharp pin or something like that in your finger, then you're going to automatically pull your hand up and away from it, and you're not even fully processing what has happened quite yet. So there's different types of reflexes. The big one is the one that we just talked about, which is the withdrawal reflex. That's because of a painful stimulus, but also the corneal reflex. So for instance, if something touches your eye, then we're going to contract the orbicularis oculi muscles that are surrounding our eye so that we can close our eye. Okay, and you do that again, it's really, you can actually get to a point where you can consciously control that. For instance, if you wear contact lenses, you can hold your eye open and put your contact lens in, but that's not always the case. And then we also stretch reflex, and this is not something that people are really aware of, but that has to do with sort of maintaining a constant length of our muscles, because we cause a contraction of the muscles compensating for that stretch. We sense that stretch along what's called a stretch spindle, which is right here. This again is that reflex arc. So we get that arrival of the stimulus, that's going to send the signal through our sensory neuron. It's going to come in through that dorsal root. We're going to have that interneuron so that we can then send that signal through for processing. Here, we're going to do that through our collateral or our columns over here. But at the same time, we're also exiting out of that ventral root, sending an activation of the motor neuron so that we can have a response by our effector. This will happen before this usually arrives. So there's sensory perception, and remember, sensation, that's going to be like your five senses, but above and beyond those five senses, which hopefully you remember what all of those are, vision, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. Okay. We also have balance and pressure, vibration, and even kinesthesia is a part of the sort of sensation. Like, you know, if you're balanced, what the pressure is. If you go, maybe you're like a diver and you go down deep, you can feel a sensation of pressure. You can also feel if something vibrates against you. Kinesthesia is sort of how is your body moving? And then there's the perception, okay? And so the perception is actually that central processing. So we have to process all of that sensory stimuli into a meaningful pattern, and we do that through our brain and our spinal cord, okay? So there's different types of sensory receptors. We have free nerve endings. Free nerve endings we looked at when we talked about the integumentary system. Remember, those are going to be often associated with pain or temperature readings. We have what are called encapsulated endings. Encapsulated endings would be right here. Those would be like the Meissner's corpuscles that we looked at in the skin, or the Pacinian corpuscles. And then we have some specialized receptor cells. So for instance, the rods and the cones within the eyes, these are specialized receptor cells. We also have some sensory receptors by location. So we might call them exteroreceptors, because extero means external. Interoreceptors means internal. And then we have proprioreceptors, which are detecting that stretch, and so for location or movement. And there are mechanoreceptors, so that means they're mechanical, so the touch or the pressure. chemoreceptors, has to do with chemical change. So our smell, our taste, those are going to be chemoreceptors. We have thermoreceptors, which is a temperature. Nociceptors, those are going to be like noxious things, so damaging, like pain or poison. And then photoreceptors has to do with light. Okay? So the 5 special senses are gustation, olfaction, vision, audition, and touch. Gustation is taste, okay? And within your tongue, you actually have these little bumps. We call those papilla, okay? And the taste buds contain what are called gustatory chemoreceptor cells. Gustatory chemoreceptor cells, okay? And so you can see them here. We have different ones. So back here, along that back part of the tongue, you have what are called circumvallate papilla. Along the edge in the back, you have foliate papilla. You have filiform papilla towards the front, and then sort of in the center, you have the fungiform papilla. And they're all shaped differently. Okay? And so you'll see here, you have all of these gustatory cells. Okay? And there's little taste hairs with little taste pores attached, and they're going to bind to, so any sort of chemical that you eat is actually going to bind to those receptors, and then it's going to trigger the gustatory cell to send out an act potential. Okay? So there's different kinds of sort of gustation that we have. We have salty. Salty is the presence of sodium ions. Sour is the presence of hydrogen ions or acids. Sweets is glucose, and the glucose actually binds to a G protein. Bitter is when we have a depolarization or even a hyperpolarization of those gustatory cells. This is also activated through our poison and our gag reflex. And then there's savory. Savory is actually now referred to as umami. Okay. So how does smell work? So smell is also a chemoreceptor, just like in taste, right? So they're actually really closely related. When you smell something, you can sometimes almost taste it, right? Kind of idea. So we have these chemoreceptors, and they're found within our olfactory epithelium, the skin within our nasal passages, right? So if you sort of think back, this is the nasal concha that are sort of directing the air flow, right? And when we breathe in through our nose. And this right here is that olfactory foramina, all those little holes, if you remember, on the cribriform plate of that ethmoid bone. Okay? And so they're kind of hanging out within our nasal passages. We have this layer of mucus. One of the reasons why we have the mucus is because those molecules are they diffuse easier through a liquid than they do through the gas. Okay? So here's our mucus. There's the olfactory cilia. And we're going to have the smell odorant is going to bind to those proteins within the mucus. They travel to those olfactory dendrites. Sorry, I lost my mouse. And then we're going to cause an action potential to travel. Okay. And we're going to then form that sort of connection point at the olfactory tract. So remember, the olfactory bulb is right there. Here, this is the olfactory nerve, that's cranial nerve number 1. And then for audition, our hearing. So let's just go over the anatomy of the ear really quickly. This is the outer ear. It's called the auricle, sometimes also called the pinna. And then you have your ear canal. It's also called the auditory tube, or you might hear it in all different kinds of ways. And what happens is that we have these sound waves that are going to travel through this external ear range, and it's going to hit the tympanic membrane. Another name for the tympanic membrane, which you might be familiar with, is the eardrum. The eardrum is then going to vibrate along the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Okay, and those are the auditory ossicles. These are the ones that we learned when we talked about the skeletal system. Okay, and so if you want to remember them in order, which hopefully you do, it spells MIS, M-I-S. Okay, and now that stapes is attached into the oval window, which comes into contact with the vestibule. Okay, so you're going to see these semicircular canals, as well as the cochlea. And these are all, this is all filled with fluid. And so what happens is that we have that vibration against that tympanic membrane. It's going to cause the vibration against these auditory ossicles, which are going to vibrate against that oval window, and therefore going to vibrate against the vestibulocochlear area. When that happens, we're going to get within that oval window, and we get that vibration, and we have what's called a cochlear duct. And inside the cochlear duct is this organ of Corti right here. Okay? And the organ word is not for like an organ within your body. It's more like an organ like a piano kind of organ. Okay? Maybe you guys had those. My grandparents had an organ that I always liked to play at their house. I was super good at it. So here's that organ of Corti, and the fluid is actually vibrating against that, and it's causing a wave within the fluid, which is filled, it was just in that vestibule area, okay? And it's crossing over that organ of Corti, and it's sort of like folding over the hairs almost like keys on a piano, okay? And the frequency of that is going to change depending on what the frequency of the wave is, okay? So it's going to bend that membrane down to a point of maximum vibration for that given frequency, and then those hair cells in the basilar membrane are going to vibrate, and that's going to send the signal through. So here's that organ of Corti right here, okay? And they have that wave going across them, okay? And here is the basilar membrane right there. Here are what we have are called stereocilia or cilia right there on there. They're connecting into a hair cell. There's that tectorial membrane. And so it's sort of pushing down, like I said, like keys on a piano. This is a video to show you sort of what sound is like. And I don't know if this is going to work. We'll see. Try again. So now we're going to talk about vision. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to go over the lab. In lab, we talked about all of the anatomy structure, but for those of you who don't have lab, let me just review it really quickly. So this is the cornea. The cornea is the outer structure that's covered the eye. That's something that you may have heard somebody has scratched their cornea. That's because that's that outer protective layer. Okay, then behind the cornea, in front of the iris is the colored part of the eye, you have what's called the anterior chamber. The anterior chamber has a fluid within it. It's called the aqueous or the aqueous humor. It's sort of a watery fluid. Okay. Then you're going to find the lens, and the lens is you have to shoot through the pupil. The pupil is the black part of the eye, and then you're going to go through the lens. Okay. And the light is going to shine back here through to the fovea centralis. The fovea centralis is right there with the macula lutea, and that is an area of a consistent amount of rods and cones. Okay, this is the optic disc or the optic nerve head. You may have heard it referred to. That's going to be the blind spot, but we don't actually perceive that as a blind spot because your brain is able to fill that in with the two eyes. Okay, this area back here is called the retina. Then you have the choroid, and then the sclera is the white of the eye. They also have some muscles within the eye, and those help to, as you know, you have pretty good movement of your eyes. If you can cross your eyes, look all over, and spin them all around, and we do that through those muscles. So we have the superior rectus and the inferior rectus. Those are the ones that are going sort of straight back from the middle. Rectus hold to erect, right? Then we have the medial rectus towards the inside and the lateral rectus towards the outside. We also have obliques. So we have an inferior oblique and a superior oblique. So those retinal cells are going to be right in the back of the retina. And we have many different types of cells back there. We have the rods and the cones. Those are the ones that you may have heard of before. The rods are going to be a low light, and they contain a molecule called rhodopsin. And then we have the cones, and the cones allow us to have color vision. And they contain what are called opsins. They were called retinal opsins sometimes. We have the red, the green, the blue, and then they also perceive bright light. Okay, so the cones are the ones color vision, bright light, and then the rods are the low light. Okay. So within our eye, we have these retinal molecules. So here's a rod right here. Okay? And within that rod, we have those rhodopsin molecules that I talked about. Okay? And what happens is that when a photon of light enters them, it actually will cause a reaction or a change in what the chemical shape is, the chemical shape. So here we have what's called transretinal. So this is what transretinal looks like. Okay? And then this is cisretinal or 11 cisretinal. Okay, so they have the same general chemical components with the carbon and the hydrogens and the number of oxygens as well, but they've changed shape. So they've almost like they've reassembled themselves. It's like if you had a bunch of blocks and you took them apart and then reassembled them in a whole new shape. That is essentially what's happening here. So when the light enters the back of the eye, it's going to trigger that photochemical reaction within those rods and the cones along the back of the eye. So here's those rods and the cones along the back of the eye, the light is shining all the way through. Okay, these are the cones. The blue ones are the rods. And as you can see, right, there's a bunch more rods than cones. Okay, so low light, bright light. So when that happens, we get a chemical reaction. So that chemical reaction is going to be essentially an action potential. And we've talked in great detail about those action potentials. And so we're basically going to start to cause a depolarization. Okay? And we're going to depolarize. And that's going to then send that signal so that we can go to our visual cortex. And it actually goes through the thalamus and the visual cortex. Perception of what we're seeing is in the occipital lobe. Touch, we've gone into great detail with touch when we talked about the skin, but just to review, we have those free nerve endings, we have the Merkel discs, the Ruffini organs, the Pacinian corpuscles, and the Meissner's corpuscles. Those Meissner corpuscles are going to be for light, gentle touch. The Pacinian corpuscles are going to be for a deeper pressure. Ruffini organs sort of has to do with pressure. Merkel discs are also for a fine touch perception, and then the free nerve endings are generally for pain. So this is actually showing us the spinal cord in a cross section. And what we're looking at here are our different pathways. So we have the ascending or the afferent pathways, they're going to be carrying our peripheral sensations up to the brain, okay? So it's arriving to the brain, okay? Those are the ones that are going to be shown in blue here. And then we have our descending. Our descending are also called our efferent pathways, and they're going to carry the motor commands down to the skeletal muscles, okay? So that's that exiting signal from our brain down to the rest of our body to sort of tell it what to do, okay? These pathways we find within the white matter, okay? And so we have what are called our column systems and our pyramids. So right here, this is our dorsal column region. We have our spinocerebellar tracts, and we have our anterolateral system right there. Okay? And then we have our pyramidal tracts right there in the red. These are going to be our motor descending pathways. And then we have our extra pyramidal tracts. Extra means outside of. Okay? So we have what's called the dorsal column system. So remember, these are going through the dorsal column, and these are ascending. So they are the arriving pathway. They're going up, ascending from our sensation and then up to our brain so that we can process. So these are primarily responsible for those touch sensations and proprioception. Where are we within time and space? If I hold out my arm, I should probably know that it's off to my left side or my right side. I should know where my limbs are, and that's sort of that awareness of our own bodies. We also have our ascending sensation, our spinothalamic tract, okay? And that's primarily responsible for pain and temperature sensations, okay? We have our trigeminal pathway. You may recognize that word, the trigeminal. That's from our cranial nerves. So it's going to carry the information from our face, our head, our mouth, and our nasal cavities. We have our sensory pathway for gustation that's going to travel along the facial and glossopharyngeal cranial nerves, and then our sensory pathway for audition travels along the vestibulocochlear nerve. Then we have the descending pathways. The descending are the efferent pathways. These are motor motor pathways. So we have the corticospinal tract, and that corticospinal tract is really responsible for our rapid, skilled, and voluntary movements. In the front or the anterior, we have what's called the axial muscle control. So hopefully you remember that axial skeleton that's along the center portion of your body. And then the lateral is going to be for our appendicular muscle control, so out towards arms and legs. We also have the corticobulbar tract. And the corticobulbar tract, you can see right here, there along that precentral gyrus. Okay, there it is. And so within that, we have the movements of our eyes, tongues, chewing, expression, and speech. This is cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And then we have those extra pyramidal controls. So remember, those are the ones that are going to be on the outside of the pyramids. So these are also descending tracts. So that means that it's going to be a motor pathway sending the signal, or we could call it an efferent pathway. Okay. So we have the tectospinal tract. That's going to be for posture. The reticulospinal tract is for posture, and then also our coordination of our movements. The vestibulospinal tract, posture and movement, and then balance with our vestibular system. Remember, the fluid within our ears helps us to maintain that balance. The rubrospinal tract has to do with coordinating movement. So as we're like walking in water, for instance, and it's also called the red nucleus. We have it in our midbrain. This is showing you kind of visualization of what I was talking about. So along the back portion in the dorsal column, you have your touch sensations and your proprioceptions of your arms and your legs. Here you have your pain and your temperature sensations. And these, again, these are arriving, so our afferent or sensory pathways. Okay. And then over here within the pyramids, you have your rapid and skilled voluntary movements. So the anterior corticospinal tract is going to be for axial. The lateral corticospinal tract is going to be for the appendicular. Okay. Then you have your extra pyramidal tract. So the rubrospinal tract is going to be for walking in water. Then you have your posture and your locomotion. And then you have your balance with your vestibulospinal tract. So we've already gone over this. This is a review sort of, oh, sorry, this is actually our visceral reflex arc. So we've gone over our reflex arc. Let me back it up. Sorry if that's going really fast. Okay. So this is our motor reflex arc right here. Okay. And now we're going to talk about our visceral. Visceral is going to be inside of your body, like you've maybe heard of like a visceral reaction or visceral organs, right? And so this is our visceral reflex arc. So we have a stimulus that's going to happen. So we have sensory receptors within our viscera, within our internal organs. Okay? And that's going to be connecting in to a sensory fiber. It's a visceral sensory fiber. It's an afferent pathway because it's arriving to our central nervous system. It's going to go in through the dorsal root, just like our sensory receptors for our the rest of our body are going to go through, right? So they're going to go through that dorsal root ganglion. We're going to integrate here. So it may be a preganglionic neuron. Okay? And then we're going to have some sort of effect. So we have what's called a visceral effector so that we can have a response. So you can see here that we actually come into contact with what's called the preganglionic axon. Then we're going to hit our ganglionic neuron right there before we hit our visceral effector. All right, so that is chapter 14. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I am happy to